Welcome back. I'm happy to have with me on our program Lisa Galino and Bill Patnode, both of whom are on our Diocesan Committee for Evangelization. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Many of our Catholic people may not be sure of what this year of evangelization is all about. I think sometimes when they hear the word evangelization, they think it's like something non-Catholic, you know, something to do with the TV evangelist or something like that. You want to address that a little bit, Lisa?
Sure. The year of evangelization, as you know, has been commissioned by Bishop Tobin, and it's a wonderful opportunity in which we as Catholics can take a moment and really do what our baptismal promises are all about: evangelize, proclaim the good news. Bill, maybe you want to say a few specifics.
Sure, and I think the specific that I always use is it's being who we are and reminding Catholics of who we are and what we should be doing and what our faith is all about. So often in noticing and going back and looking at my experience of being a Catholic and then not being a Catholic for 20 years and then being a Catholic again, one of the things that strikes me is that oftentimes I have, and other Catholics will tend to say, well, this is my faith and it's just me. And that's really an isolating tendency. And what evangelization is all about is sharing and inviting and welcoming. And so we have been trying to do that on a diocesan level, helping the diocese prepare for the committee to do this. But then we've also been trying to provide resources and opportunities for parishes to do that too, to invite, to welcome, to share the faith. Because it's not just for me, it's for everyone.
Right. The Catholic principle is community, right? Correct. It's not just Jesus and me, it's Jesus and us.
Yes.
That's the real Catholic.
Love of God and love of neighbor, and that love of neighbor part, sometimes we lose that.
Especially in our country, because I think religion has become kind of a privatized thing. We don't talk about our faith. You know, I believe what I believe and you believe what you believe, and we just ought to keep it to ourselves, which is exactly the opposite of what evangelization is all about, right, Lisa?
And I think that's one of the things that, in kind of setting the tone for us, Bishop Tobin said it best when he looked at two main reasons we want to be about evangelizing: welcoming, inviting people back to, as you said, Monsignor, that faith community. It's the community, our parish communities, which is our Catholic Church. And then the other aspect of it, and I think this is why it's great being involved in the Year of Evangelization Committee, is because it's helped to also help engage the people who are already in our pews, engage them in a deeper learning process of the faith.
Sure, it's kind of a re-energizing them, isn't it, Bill? Kind of giving another little bit of a spark to that which is already there.
Exactly, and a lot of it is, and one of the great resources we have with Lisa is that whole educational component. Because there is so much about the faith that we don't know. And my generation, when we went through religious ed, they left a lot out. So rediscovering that, or in some cases discovering that through religious education resources, through what we can do with the Year of Evangelization, is really an exciting time, because you go, wow, I didn't know the faith said that. The commercials that have been running have been wonderful, that one epic commercial, because it reminds us that, yeah, we compiled the Bible. We created a worldview where science and faith can intermingle and all of that. Things to be proud of.
Right. The great Catholic intellectual tradition as well. The great theological tradition of the Church throughout 2,000 years. But I think that certainly impelled Bishop Tobin. But don't you think it's also the fact that people seem to be rather indifferent? They, you know, they don't sort of feel the need to come. So I think we need to show those who have drifted away and those who are interested or not Catholics, who exactly we are, what we're all about, what we are as a church, what God has done and is doing through the church in Jesus Christ, through the sacraments, through the scriptures, through the witness of lay people who are involved in all kinds of things in the diocese. I think we are sort of like, we're the best kept secret, you know what I mean? People just have stereotyped ideas about what the church is and what it does, but we want to say more than that, don't we?
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing when Bishop mentioned about engaging those who are already present but need to take a step deeper into the faith. Look at the liturgy. I come here to the cathedral and we have wonderful liturgies. And first off, it's a 2,000-year tradition. And so let's look at the different parts of the liturgy. Why do we do what we do in Mass? And it's so enriching and life-giving. You mentioned the sacraments. You know, a very simple definition from the Catechism is that the sacraments are ever-living, life-giving, healing touch of Jesus upon the soul.
Right.
We've heard other definitions many years ago, but I think that's a very personal definition, and it brings us into the heart of the church.
Sure. I think people think too, well, we love Jesus, but we really don't need the church. Well, the church was, of course, our Lord's idea. He founded it. So they sort of try to separate often Jesus and the church he founded. It's just not possible to do, is it?
No, and part of that is the command to love your neighbor can be messy. And one of the things that Benedict keeps talking about is bringing that concept of love back into our very real experiences. Mm-hmm. Being a member of the church, being a member of a church, a parish, involves sacrifice. I can't always get my way because, sometimes my neighbor needs something and I have to stop my plans and help.
Right.
And that can be inconvenient sometimes.
Right. And in a culture like ours where it's all about me, we sort of glorify the self, glorify the ego, what I want, what I need. We're exactly about the opposite.
It is. I think we stand very much in contradiction to being relativism. I think Pope Benedict is really speaking of that there are truths. And we believe that they are found within the Catholic Church.
Right.
And within this discovering of the truth, it always brings us into that community again. A community that at the very heart is the heart of Christ flowing over so that we can go forth and wave through that messiness of loving your neighbor. And the Church has taught us through 2,000 years of how to do that well.
Right, exactly. And the whole notion, especially we talk about the global village, the whole world everybody's our neighbor now. And this came out beautifully, I think, in the diocese when we had this terrible tragedy in Haiti. The amount of money and assistance that people in our own diocese gave to aid these poor people. It was a wonderful thing. I spoke in the first part of this program about the theological virtue of hope. A lot of people in our culture and in our world, for so many reasons, seem rather hopeless. How can our evangelization effort address that hopelessness of people?
Well, Monsignor, it goes to what you just said about our culture is a culture which keeps us isolated, which focuses us on us. That is not what it means to be human. And part of what evangelization is doing is to say, no, you're part of this community. And that's what it means to be human. And that's where you find your hope. We are hopeless when we are so focused on ourselves that there is nothing outside of ourselves, or we don't see anything outside of ourselves for which to have hope, like, say, God. Right. So evangelization is a reminder that by being connected, love of God and love of neighbor, there is hope, because there is something greater than me to which I can rely on.
Right, and especially in a situation like ours, for example, with the economy, where this has collapsed so badly, the support systems that we placed all our trust in have kind of disappointed us. So we know now that our hope is in God. St. Augustine's, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. We're sort of wired that way, aren't we, Lisa? We're wired for God.
I couldn't agree more, and I think one of the things that our cultural situation, our economic situation is teaching us is that we need to place our hope, our trust in something bigger than ourselves. What is that? That's the relationship with Jesus Christ, and particularly with Jesus and his church. And I think that's one of the things we talk about, that word evangelizing, means proclaiming the good news that Christ has come. Catechesis is handing on the faith that has been given to us from Jesus Christ, from Jesus to the apostles to our present day. So evangelizing catechesis is the good news about Christ, and in that is hope. It's about putting people into an intimate union with Christ.
We were just talking about that. As Pope Benedict always says, being a Catholic is not simply a relationship to an institution. It's a relationship to a person. This personal relationship with Jesus Christ is what we really want to bring to the fore. And we do that through not only our own personal purpose with the church, we experience this personal relationship with Christ. It's kind of odd when people love one another, they spend time together. If we say we love the Lord, then it seems to me we want to spend time with him. We shouldn't have to make a rule about it, a law of the church about it, but it seems, don't you think, that we would want to spend time with Christ, right?
Personal relationship requires trust. And for lots of us, I know myself included, part of my spiritual journey is trusting. And when the tough times come, to say, all right, I don't have to be in control of this. I'm not the general manager of the universe. I'm going to hand this over to Christ and say, okay, I'm going to relax now, because you got it, like as the gentleman in the commercial said, you got it under control.
But you know, Lisa, it's very easy to trust God when it's all going, you know, well, when everything is sort of going according to Hoyle. But when things change, when like this economy collapsed, or we have personal suffering and losses and stuff like that, that's quite different, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's why, I mean, you mentioned the manager of the universe, what a great image. When we think about this, we're engaged in our living relationship with God. And what this needs to do is translate into our everyday life. The church, Christ, founded the church to give us a way in which to do that, and that's the sacraments. I think sometimes when we think about this relationship, we forget that God in his genius, in his infinite knowledge, gives us concrete signs of his presence with us. Is that true? You know, I think
sure. We're human. We need those signs. We're human beings. We have bodies. We need to see visible signs of things, don't we? That's the way it works. That's why the church is a visible reality. You know, other people in the church, we experience it because we are human beings. We have bodies, we have senses, and so forth, and that's very important.
I think reconciliation is a wonderful idea, you know, reality of that. Christ gives us that moment in which we can hear, I forgive you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Go and sin no more.
Right. Right.
And if you do, there's the sacrament.
You know, and the whole idea of the church, I think, you know, I've often said, you know, the scandals in the church, the ones we read about in the paper are scandalous. There's no question about it. But the real scandal in the church is that we don't live what we believe, and I think that's one of the greatest enemies, one of the greatest things that block people from coming to the church, is that we say we believe one thing in church, and we live a completely opposite way out there. And I think that is really, you know, it's bringing what we say we believe and the way we live and act together. I suppose we call that integrity, don't we? Mm-hmm. Don't you think that's what this is?
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, you know, people of every age have all asked the same questions, you know, who am I? What is my purpose in life? What happens to me when I die? I think that's at the core of this year of evangelization, to address the real fundamental questions of the human person, don't you feel?
Absolutely, and I think our culture almost imposes those questions on us more and more. You mentioned very well about, you know, these economic times, the cultural situation in which we live in. Sometimes we forget, and we're kind of forced to ask the question, what is this all about? Who am I? You know, is this all there is to it? And when we take moment, but we need to silence ourselves to do that. We're better environed than, you know, the church or taking time.
Why do you think, Bill, that people are so afraid of silence in our culture?
Well, you get to hear what's going on inside of your mind, and you get to hear the whisper of God calling you. And I think sometimes that's intimidating, because it goes back to trust. Do I trust?
Yeah.
Do I extend my hand? Do I take that step? I don't know where it's leading, but I am to trust that it's to a good place, it's to a better place, but I don't know, because the world that we live in is very concrete in terms of Western civilization's embracing of science and knowledge. Everything has to be known. Positivism, it has to be, is the manner that we exist. So to have faith in something that we don't see, although we do, if we open our eyes, it can be difficult.
Sure. Lisa, people, you know, we're afraid to talk about death in our society. So it's like one of the last taboos, isn't it? I mean, people say, you know, I'm 60, I'm middle age. If you plan on living to be 120, 60 is middle age, right? Exactly. I mean, but why are we so afraid to talk about, we know it's going to happen? I mean, it's even more sure than taxes. So why do you think people are so afraid to talk about death?
Yeah, because we haven't asked those fundamental questions that you raise. We haven't asked, who am I? You know, what am I made for? Why was I created? What is this life all about? And that goes back to the idea of hope. Pope Benedict says that great quote, those who hope live differently. So if we believe in Christ, if we have this relationship with him, then what we're going to discover is that we're people of hope and we will live differently. We need that lens of faith to interpret life.
And I think, you know, we perhaps, Bill, made a disconnect between this life and the life to come. You know, we live here for so many years and then we will heavens for later. No, we begin to live that eternal life now, don't we? Through the resurrection of Christ.
Absolutely, and a lot of this this disconnect is in some ways our doing and the doing of the people who've come before us, who've been entrusted to pass on the faith. You know, the belief that there's that ancient heresy that's returning, that the physical world is bad and this world is bad, and we will someday die and be freed from that, this awful world that we live in, when in reality creation is good, and the recreation that's promised to us is going to be even better. So the joy that comes from that faith, hope is something that becomes a tool for evangelization, for when we are filled with that, and we are able to express that, and we stay close to the sacraments, that in those times of crises, people look to someone like Lisa or you, or hopefully maybe even me, and say, gee, they're acting differently. They're not as concerned. They have peace about them. Why? What is that? And those are the types of questions that can lead to a conversation, which can hopefully lead to bring someone back home.
And I think that's what people want in their lives. They want peace, don't they? Really, I mean, despite it all, you know, going through the crises of adolescence and young adulthood and all that stuff, people really are looking for some kind of peace of mind, peace of soul, don't you think, Lisa?
Absolutely, and you mentioned that word integrity. Peace comes through integrity, you know.
Yeah, it's being who you are, who God calls you to be. You know, in the old Baltimore Catechism, when I was a kid in the last century, they had why did God make you? God made me to know Him, to love Him, to serve Him in this world, and to be happy with Him forever in heaven. Well, there it is. Now, a lot of the geniuses in our universities haven't figured that out yet, right? I mean, all the philosophy departments and all that stuff. I mean, my grandmother, who was Italian and couldn't read, knew that, right? So maybe we've got to get back to that. You know, this is why we're here. We're hardwired for God, you know. St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. So this is what this is all about, isn't it?
It is. And I think, again, this year of evangelization, I think, can bear much fruit. And I think one of the fruits it can bear is helping people to say, I need to take time to ask some of those fundamental questions, and maybe even reorder my priorities. First priority is God.
Right. Right, and then everything flows from that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Once you've got yourself straight, so to speak, prioritized, and then God comes first, and everything else just sort of, you have that eternal perspective, so to speak. You know, after all, we Christians are people who look at things from the perspective of eternity. You know, that's why people say, oh, the church is so slow to move. They said the church thinks in centuries. That's because it's been around for centuries, you know? I mean, nobody moves that quickly when you've been around that long. There's no rush, so to speak. Now, Lisa, as our director of religious education for the diocese, I think there is we talked about this failure of religious education, which is our fault. You know, we have to own that. I mean, for many years after the council, substantial things concerning the faith were just left unaddressed. So I think now, with this year of evangelization, there's a great need, I think, for adult religious education. That's difficult to do because you got to get them to come. But I think, you know, we have a lot of people trying to live a mature faith, facing complex problems with an infantile or adolescent knowledge of the faith. Absolutely. And it doesn't work. No. It can't work.
And I think that we as church, if you will, we need to help people grow in and mature in. Isn't that the life of grace? Mature in faith and help them to own it. I think starting with parents, our parents of religious ed students or Catholic school parents, helping them to really take God as priority, build that into their family life. We so often go to professional development for our job. You know, how much more should we really be taking time to, have I this year spent some time studying my faith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that you're involved in religious education. I mean, the very simple fact of the matter, you go into someone's house, you never see a crucifix. You don't see an image of Our Lady. You don't see images of the saints, our heroes, our heroines. You see Mickey Mouse, you see Donald Duck. I mean, you're involved in religious ed too, you know. So it's really, it's sort of just a separate thing, isn't it?
It is, and what strikes me sometimes is how parents often know enough or have a desire enough or they're in tune enough with themselves to know that they want to pass on something to their children. Sure. Even if they don't know what that is. Right. And they're eager to find out, and many times. Of course, the challenge that we always face is the time that parents don't have today, because there's all the, usually sports, but music, and there's so much going on. Sure. And it becomes, for me anyway, frustrating, because you see these parents unhappy, and they will admit that to you because they're so busy, and you want to say, well, just take a little bit of time to do this, and everything else will fall into place.
Right.
And again, that goes back to that trust issue we were talking about.
Right.
I just heard a great quote, though, that the real busy person, the truly busy person, has to take time to pray. Because, you know, you need to take that time to help keep yourself focused. And,
Amen.
and I think God really, didn't he multiply the fishes and the loaves? He can certainly, he's the creator of time.
Right.
He could multiply our time.
Right, and if you look at the life of someone like even John, I mean, who is busier than the Pope? You know, I mean, that's even for a man his age, that's a hectic schedule. I mean, look back at John Paul II, God rest him. I mean, the prayer was the real priority, oftentimes during the day, and you know, because you're right, it keeps you absolutely focused. You know who you are and what you're supposed to be doing, and that being in that presence is just a kind of constant reminder of that, isn't it? You know, the Second Vatican Council spoke about the apostolate of the laity, and I think we sort of misinterpreted that. We thought it meant making like Eucharistic ministers and lectors, and which is all fine. We sort of clericalized the laity and laicized the clergy. You know what I mean? It was kind of an inverse, but that's not what the council meant by the apostolate of the layperson, because the layperson is supposed to witness to Christ in the world, the places where the bishop and the priest and the religious can't go. You know, I can't come into your workplace and say, you know, I'm going to give me an hour, I'm going to give you a homily. You know, your boss probably wouldn't like that.
I would like that.
But I mean, this is what it is, right? So have we lost that sense, Bill, that, you know, we've got to be out there being leaven in the world by our example, by the way we live, by being different?
I think that sense is coming to fruition. The rule of thumb that I've always heard is that a good counsel takes a century to really become effective into what it was meant. So we're on the way. But I know exactly what you mean. I mean, as a layperson, you know, oftentimes I'm a single male, so everybody says, why don't you go into the priesthood because your faith is so important to you. However, there's a role for me working, you know, for the state, having a job in the real world, where I can bear witness to my faith, even if it's just a prayer card that's over my desk or a calendar from my parish. People know and they make that connection. And then the tough part is, you know, you're being watched at that point, because how do you respond to this? How do you deal with this situation?
Again, the integrity issue, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm still working on that.
Yeah, we all are. We all are. That's part of it. That's life work. That's lifelong, right? But that's true. Don't you think, Lisa? I mean, we've got to remind our laymen and women that, you know, the proclamation of the gospel doesn't just belong to certain people. It belongs to the entire church, and by virtue of their baptism, it belongs to them, doesn't it?
Right, and I think that was one of the other ingenious aspects, a reminder of Vatican II, was that sense of a universal call to holiness. Mm-hmm. Holiness is really just, again, that idea of priority, you know, helping God, making sure that God is the center of our life, and acting and living as if he is. And that transforms. You know, C.K. Chesterton says something great. The greatest witness for Christianity are Christians.
That's right.
The toughest, the worst case for Christians are
Christianity.
Christians.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. That's so true. But this whole idea of holiness, you know, it's almost a word that we're afraid to say to kids, and they misunderstand it. I think people think that holiness means you look miserable. You know, the more miserable you look, the holier you are. It's like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You never laugh. Well, that's not, the point is that a person that's holy knows how to love the world, right? How to enjoy the world, how to laugh and live and eat and love and die and all that stuff, and do it well, it seems to me, don't you think, Bill?
Absolutely. When now Pope Benedict XVI was Cardinal Ratzinger in the 1960s, he wrote a very important work on St. Bonaventure, and he had this concluding line that a church that seeks peace in the future is nonetheless obliged to love in the present. And that love in the present brings about that peace, the joy, all of that helps us strive to holiness. But it's being in the moment with this person and loving. Right. And it's that simple. And when you work on that long enough, I think what happens is you get that joy that becomes contagious.
I think, Lisa, we miss so many opportunities, don't we, to witness to the gospel, even in our own personal lives among our family and friends. I think sometimes we're so preoccupied with doing that we forget about being.
Right, and I think in our culture too, that's always you know, a balance needs to be between doing. We are called to go and do and to serve, but also we have the energy to do and serve by being in God's presence. And I think it's so very important that as we consider and maybe take this time of year of evangelization to get more in touch with God, is just to be certain that we really know that there's a deep joy that comes from living our faith. Mm-hmm. You know, and it goes back to what you said, Monsignor, you know, quoting St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they find rest. And
right.
Once we connect our heart with God's heart,
Yeah.
things still happen that are difficult, but there's a joy and there's a sense of peacefulness.
Yeah, and that's right. And joy is a sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit. That's why I bristle at the idea that being holy means being miserable and looking sad and serious and all the time and all that. You know, joy is, where's the joy in all this? You know, I think that even we as priests, you know, how do we attract other men to the priesthood, young men to the priesthood? Well, not if we're miserable. You know, who wants to be like that? I'm going to be like him, you know. But we want to be joyful, you know, so that people will see that this priest is happy being a priest. He's fulfilled in his vocation, right? And that's true of even just being a Catholic. This person is happy with their faith. We're not embarrassed by it. We're not running away from it. We're not trying to water it down. Don't you think, Bill? I think that's important.
Absolutely. In fact, my coming back to the church after being away for 20 years was due to an invitation from a very joy-filled priest. God kept putting me in his path, and each time Father Robert Marciano,
oh, sure. Yeah, very well.
So every time I would meet him, I would be kind of surprised. Gee, that priest is happy.
What's he so happy about?
so I was intrigued, and that really helped. It did. It intrigued me, and it drew me in. So yeah, that's absolutely. And I think that the fact that the year of evangelization is coinciding with the year for priests is a beautiful thing, because I think in many ways. It's supporting the priesthood by reminding us how important the priesthood is. The sacraments exist because of the priesthood, and we can't have the Eucharist unless we have men like you who give up their lives to do this. So there's a wonderful connection there.
Yeah, and as we've said before, at the very heart of any success, so to speak, in the church is prayer. Absolutely. You know, because this is not about us. Sometimes we act like it is, but it's really not about us, is it?
No, and I think that's when you go back to, you know, the apostle of the laity. I mean, we need to be turning everything that we say and do, and no matter if it's, right now we were over in the office and we were all stuffing envelopes for a big mailing, and we really were sitting there talking, and it was a wonderful moment where we were saying we can even turn this into prayer.
Absolutely.
You know, and so just realizing that the smallest of tasks, if we turn it into a prayerful presence, then it now has just turned that work into, you know, work for eternity.
Well, Bill, Mother Teresa said there's nothing small in God's eyes, right? Smallest act of kindness, the smallest prayer becomes infinite, right?
Correct.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for being with us. It's been a pleasure, and it's been an informative conversation. Thank you both. God bless you.
Thank you, Monsignor.
Thank you.